The sun peeked over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. Retired Major Mark sat quietly on the front porch of his small, neat house, sipping a cup of tea and watching the sunrise over the peaceful little town. At 90 years old, Mark had lived through more than most people could imagine. His days of serving in the military were long behind him, but his mind was still sharp, and his memories of those days were as clear as ever. He had seen battles, lost friends, and carried the weight of responsibility for those under his command. Now, his life had settled into a peaceful routine, a much slower pace than it used to be. Mark lived alone, but he didn't mind it. He enjoyed the quiet. His house was small but comfortable, with a garden out back where he grew flowers and vegetables. He spent his mornings tending to the plants, his afternoons reading old war books or working on small projects around the house, and his evenings watching the birds from his porch. He found peace in the simplicity of it all. But lately, something had been disturbing that peace. A group of bikers had started riding through town every week. They were loud, rude, and always looking for trouble. At first, they didn't bother Mark directly. They would roar past his house, their engines growling like angry beasts, but they didn't stop. Mark would just sit quietly on his porch, watching them with a slight frown, hoping they would move on. Then one day, they didn't. It was a Tuesday afternoon when it first happened. Mark was sitting in his usual spot, sipping his tea, when the group of bikers came roaring down the street. There were 5 of them, all dressed in black leather jackets, their motorcycles shining in the afternoon sun. They stopped right in front of his house. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he watched them laugh and joke with each other. He didn't know what they wanted, but he had a bad feeling. The leader of the group, a tall, muscular man with a shaved head and tattoos covering his arms, pointed at Mark. "Hey, old man," he shouted. "What are you looking at?" Mark didn't answer. He wasn't afraid, but he knew better than to engage with people like them. He had dealt with troublemakers before, back in his military days, and he had learned that sometimes it was best to stay quiet and let them burn out on their own. But these bikers weren't about to leave him alone. The leader smirked and revved his engine, making the motorcycle roar even louder. His friends joined in, and soon the air was filled with the deafening sound of engines. Mark winced but stayed seated, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "You deaf, old man," one of the bikers taunted, throwing a piece of trash onto Mark's lawn. "We're talking to you." Still, Mark didn't respond. He wasn't about to be dragged into their games. The leader, growing impatient, rode his bike closer to the porch, his face twisted into a cruel smile. "What's the matter? You too old to fight back?" Mark's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward, refusing to give them the reaction they wanted. Deep inside, however, a fire was starting to burn. He wasn't the weak old man they thought he was. He had been through worse than this in his life. These bikers didn't know who they were dealing with. After what felt like an eternity, the bikers finally grew bored. With one last sneer, the leader spat on Mark's lawn and shouted, "We'll be back, old man. Try not to die before then." The group laughed as they rode off down the street, their motorcycles roaring into the distance. Mark sat there for a long time after they left, his tea now cold in his hand. He didn't understand why they had targeted him. He hadn't done anything to them, hadn't even looked at them the wrong way. But they had made it clear that they would be back, and Mark knew that the next time, it might be worse. He thought about calling the police, but what would he say? That a group of bikers had been rude to him? It didn't seem like enough to warrant any real action. Besides, Mark wasn't the type to run for help at the first sign of trouble. He had handled far more dangerous situations in his life, and he wasn't about to let a group of rowdy bikers scare him into hiding. Still, as he sat on his porch, staring at the road where the bikers had disappeared, a sense of unease settled over him. He didn't want trouble, but it seemed like trouble had found him anyway. And something told him that this was only the beginning. The next day, as Mark went about his usual routine, he couldn't shake the feeling that the bikers would return. Every time he heard a distant engine, his heart would skip a beat, but it was never them. Not yet, at least. That evening, as the sun began to set, Mark sat on his porch once again, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. He knew the bikers would be back eventually, and when they did, he would be ready. But for now, all he could do was wait. As the darkness crept in and the stars began to dot the sky, Mark felt a strange calm settle over him. He had faced worse in his life. If the bikers wanted a fight, they would get one. But it would be on his terms, not theirs. He wasn't just an old man. He was retired Major Mark, and he had faced far greater battles than this. The next few days were quiet. Mark went about his usual routine, gardening in the morning, reading in the afternoon, and sitting on his porch in the evening. But a sense of unease hung in the air. He knew the bikers would return. It was only a matter of time. As he pulled weeds from his garden, his mind kept drifting back to the taunts they had thrown his way, the sneers on their faces, and the growl of their engines. The memory of their last visit played over and over in his head. Mark didn't scare easily, but something about this situation bothered him deeply. He had faced battles in the military, led men through dangerous missions, and survived when others hadn't. But now, at 90 years old, he felt vulnerable in a way he hadn't in years. He hated that feeling. It gnawed at him, making him restless. That evening, Mark sat on his porch again, in his usual spot. The warm breeze carried the smell of freshly cut grass, and the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting an orange glow over the town. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax, soaking in the peace. But it didn't last long. The distant rumble of motorcycles shattered the calm. Mark tensed immediately, his hand tightening around the armrest of his chair. They were coming back. Within minutes, the group of 5 bikers roared down the street, their loud engines drowning out the sounds of the evening. They didn't stop at first, just circled around the neighborhood, revving their engines, making as much noise as possible. People peeked out of their windows, watching from a distance, but no one dared to intervene. Finally, the bikers slowed as they approached Mark's house. The leader, the tall man with the shaved head and tattoos, stopped directly in front of Mark's porch. His friends pulled up beside him, their bikes rumbling like wild animals waiting to pounce. Mark remained seated, his eyes fixed on the leader. He didn't say anything, but his heart raced in his chest. He knew what was coming, but he wasn't sure how far they'd go this time. "Look who's still sitting here," the leader sneered, loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. "The old man who thinks he's too good for us." Mark didn't respond, keeping his gaze steady. He wasn't about to be drawn into their childish games. But his silence only seemed to anger the leader more. "What's the matter, Grandpa?" Too scared to talk, one of the other bikers shouted, laughing along with his friends. Still, Mark said nothing. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. But as the minutes ticked by, the tension grew thicker. The leader dismounted his bike and walked toward Mark's porch. The air grew still as he approached, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped just a few feet away from Mark, crossing his arms over his chest. "I asked you a question, old man. You think you're better than us?" Mark finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I don't think anything about you." The leader's eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a cruel smile. "Well, we think something about you. We think you're weak, helpless." With that, the leader nodded to one of the other bikers, who reached into his jacket and pulled out a small rock. Before Mark could react, the biker hurled the rock at Mark's house, smashing one of the front windows. Glass shattered, spraying across the porch and the ground below. Mark stood up quickly, his heart pounding, but he kept his voice steady. "That's enough. Leave." The leader laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the air. "Oh, now you want to talk? Now you think you can tell us what to do?" Mark clenched his fists at his sides, trying to hold back the anger boiling inside him. He wasn't about to let them bully him, but he also knew that physically confronting them wasn't an option. He was 90 years old. He couldn't fight like he used to, but he didn't need to. The bikers continued their taunts, throwing more rocks and kicking over trash cans. Mark's neighbors stayed inside, watching through their windows but doing nothing to help. Mark didn't blame them. No one wanted to get involved with a group like this. Finally, the leader stepped closer, invading Mark's personal space. "You're all alone, old man. No one's coming to help you. You're just a washed-up veteran living in the past. You can't do anything." Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't show fear. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. The leader raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Oh, you're going to call the cops? You think they care about you?" Mark didn't answer. He dialed a number and brought the phone to his ear. The leader laughed again, but it was an uneasy laugh this time. He could tell something was different. When the line connected, Mark spoke just 2 words: "It's time." He hung up, his face calm even as the bikers continued to mock him. But inside, Mark felt a sense of relief. He knew help was on the way. He had called in a favor, one he hadn't used in decades. And when that favor arrived, it would change everything. The bikers didn't realize it yet, but they had pushed too far. As they continued to jeer, Mark's expression remained calm, his eyes steady and focused on the leader of the group. The atmosphere around him had shifted. He had made the call. His message, those 2 simple words, "It's time," hung in the air like an invisible thread, one the bikers had yet to understand. The leader, still smirking, looked down at Mark's phone and sneered. "What? Calling for backup? You think someone's coming to save you?" He walked a few steps closer, puffing his chest out, clearly trying to intimidate. His friends revved their engines, their motorcycles growling like beasts waiting to be unleashed. Mark didn't respond. His silence unsettled the leader. He simply pocketed his phone and returned to his chair, sitting down as if he had no worries in the world. This act, this calm confidence, confused the bikers. What could this old man possibly have planned? They had been harassing him for days, and he had done nothing but sit there, taking their insults and watching them with that same unshakable stare. But now, something was different, and the leader could sense it. One of the bikers, clearly getting impatient, kicked over a trash can, sending it crashing to the ground with a loud bang. "Maybe we should teach him a real lesson," he said, his voice dripping with malice. The leader waved his hand, motioning for them to stop. He stared at Mark, trying to read him, but Mark's face was unreadable, his gaze steady. There was no fear in his eyes, no sign of the helplessness they had expected. Just calm, quiet resolve. Minutes passed. The bikers fidgeted, clearly getting restless. The leader, irritated by the lack of reaction from Mark, finally broke the silence. "You think you're untouchable, don't you, old man? But no one's coming. No one cares." Just as he finished speaking, a low rumble started in the distance. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a faint hum on the edge of the horizon. But it grew louder, steadily, unmistakably. The bikers paused, their heads turning toward the sound. It wasn't the familiar growl of motorcycle engines. This was something heavier, something more powerful. Mark remained seated, but inside, he felt a flicker of satisfaction. They were coming. The sound grew louder still, and then, appearing over the hill at the far end of the street, came military trucks. Their dark, imposing shapes rolled down the road toward Mark's house. Behind the trucks, a convoy of jeeps followed, all moving with precision and purpose. And behind the wheels of those vehicles were uniformed soldiers, dozens of them, dressed in full military gear, their faces set with determination. The leader of the bikers blinked, confusion and panic flashing in his eyes. "What the dash?" he muttered under his breath. His friends stopped revving their bikes, watching as the convoy came closer and closer. None of them had expected this. None of them knew what was happening. The trucks stopped in front of Mark's house, forming a protective wall between him and the bikers. The soldiers, all sharp-eyed and muscular, stepped out, their movements efficient and disciplined. They lined up in front of Mark's porch, standing tall and firm as if they were guarding the most important man in the world. One of the soldiers, a tall man with a deep scar running down his cheek, stepped forward and saluted Mark. "Major," he said, his voice strong and clear. "We're here, sir." The leader of the bikers took a step back, his face pale. What is this? Who are these people?" Mark stood up slowly, his old bones creaking, but his posture was as straight and proud as it had been decades ago. He walked to the edge of the porch, looking directly at the bikers, then at the soldiers. These weren't just any soldiers. These were his men, the unit he had led during his years in the military. Men who had served with him. These are my soldiers, who owed him their lives, Mark said quietly, and who had come the moment his voice carried with authority. Men who know what loyalty means. Men who don't back down when someone needs help. The leader of the bikers stammered, You can't do this. This is just Dash, but he didn't finish. One look at the soldiers standing there like statues of steel made him think twice. The soldier with the scar, Sergeant Walker, stepped closer to the bikers, his eyes cold and unyielding. You've been harassing a decorated war hero. A man who saved lives, defended his country, and stood for something real. And you think you can come here and bully him? The leader opened his mouth, but no words came out. His friends, who had been so cocky and loud moments before, were now silent, shrinking behind him. The power had shifted, and they knew it. Mark's voice cut through the tension. You made a mistake. A big one. And now you have two choices. Leave and never come back, or answer to them. He nodded toward the soldiers, whose stony expressions made it clear that they wouldn't hesitate if things escalated. The leader hesitated, glancing at his gang, then back at Mark. Finally, he threw up his hands in defeat. We're leaving, he muttered, his voice small and defeated. Come on. Let's go. One by one, the bikers revved their engines and peeled away, no longer laughing or taunting. They rode off into the distance, their defeat loud in the roar of their bikes. As the last of them disappeared, Mark exhaled slowly, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. He turned to his soldiers, his old friends. Thank you, he said softly. Sergeant Walker smiled. Always here for you, sir. Just like old times. The bikers were gone, and Mark stood tall, surrounded by men who had stood by him through thick and thin. The battle was over, but it had been won on his terms. The phone call had changed everything. As the bikers disappeared down the road, silence filled the air. The tension that had once gripped the streets slowly melted away, replaced by a sense of calm and victory. Major Mark stood tall, his eyes